Here's something they don't teach you in history class. Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. It didn't collapse because of moral decay, weak emperors, or even military defeats. Rome destroyed itself with something far more insidious. Something we're doing right now in 2025. And the worst part, the Romans knew exactly what was happening. They watched it unfold in slow motion over 2 centuries. They even tried to stop it. They failed. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire, the greatest superpower the world had ever seen, was gone. A civilization that had stood for over 1,000 years simply vanished. But here's the mystery that historians have debated for centuries. How does an empire that controlled 3 continents, commanded millions of soldiers, and possessed more wealth than any nation before it, run out of money? That's not supposed to be possible. When you control the currency, when you are the bank, when you literally own the gold mines and silver deposits across the Mediterranean, how do you go broke? The answer is going to make you deeply uncomfortable. Because it's not ancient history. It's a blueprint. And we're following it. How money destroyed ancient Rome. Act 1. The Golden Age. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand how Rome destroyed itself with money, you first need to understand just how impossibly wealthy Rome actually was. Picture this. It's 117 AD. The Roman Empire is at its absolute peak under Emperor Trajan. The empire stretches from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara Desert. Over 65 million people, nearly a third of the world's population at the time, live under Roman rule. But it's not just the size that's impressive. It's the sophistication. Rome had created something unprecedented. A unified economic zone larger than the United States, with a single currency accepted from Scotland to Syria. The denarius, Rome's silver coin, was the dollar of the ancient world. Everyone wanted it. Everyone trusted it. And everyone knew exactly what it was worth. Ancient Roman denarius coin, close-up showing silver purity. Here's the crucial detail. In the early days of the empire, a denarius was made of about 95% pure silver. It weighed roughly 3.9 grams. This wasn't arbitrary. The weight and purity were guaranteed by the emperor himself. That guarantee meant something. It meant when a merchant in Londinium, Roman Britain, accepted a denarius, and a merchant in Alexandria accepted the same denarius, they were both getting the exact same value. This created trust. And trust created wealth. The Roman economy was generating somewhere between 20 and 30 billion sesterces annually at its height. In modern terms, that's comparable to a GDP of around $100 billion in today's purchasing power. For context, that's roughly the size of Morocco's economy today. But this was in the year 100 AD, when most of humanity was barely surviving subsistence farming. Roman infrastructure, aqueducts, roads, ports. Rome used this wealth to build arguably the most impressive infrastructure network in human history. Over 250,000 miles of roads, most of them paved. Aqueducts that brought millions of gallons of fresh water to cities daily. Ports and harbors that connected the entire Mediterranean into a single economic system. The Romans called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. But here's what made Rome's wealth truly sustainable. They didn't just extract resources. They created value. Roman provinces weren't colonies in the modern sense. They were integrated economic zones. A farmer in Gaul could sell grain to a baker in Rome. A craftsman in Syria could sell textiles to a merchant in Carthage. The Roman roads, the Roman navy, the Roman legal system. All of it existed to facilitate trade. To create prosperity. And it worked. For centuries, it worked. Roman citizens enjoyed a standard of living that wouldn't be matched again until the Industrial Revolution. Running water, public baths, free grain distributions, entertainment, medicine, education. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, meant that for the first time in history, you could travel from one end of the Mediterranean to the other without fear of pirates or bandits. This was Rome's golden age. And like all golden ages, it was built on a foundation that seemed unshakable. But there was a problem. A small one at first. A problem that seemed manageable, even trivial. Rome's expansion had stopped. Act 2, the first crack. Map showing failed Roman campaigns, Germania, Parthia. By the mid-2nd century, something unprecedented was happening. Rome wasn't growing anymore. After Emperor Trajan's conquests, his successor Hadrian made a fateful decision. He decided Rome was large enough. Instead of pushing further into Germania or deeper into Parthia, he would consolidate. Defend. Maintain. He built walls. The most famous is Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain, but there were others. The entire northern frontier became a line of fortifications designed to hold territory, not expand it. On the surface, this seems reasonable. Even wise. Rome was vast. Why overextend? But here's the problem with empires. They're not designed to stay still. Economic flow chart showing Roman financial system. The entire Roman economic model was built on a simple formula. Conquer new territory, extract its resources, use those resources to pay the army, use the army to conquer more territory. It was a perpetual motion machine of expansion and wealth. When conquest stopped, the formula broke. Think about it. Rome had the largest standing army in the world. By the year 200 AD, there were roughly 400,000 soldiers on active duty, plus auxiliaries, bringing the total to over 500,000 men under arms. These weren't militias or temporary levies. These were professional soldiers who expected regular pay. And that pay wasn't cheap. A legionary earned 300 denarii per year, plus bonuses, plus retirement benefits. Do the math. 400,000 soldiers times 300 denarii equals 120 million denarii annually just for base pay. Add in equipment, supplies, fortifications, and veteran benefits, and military spending consumed somewhere between 50 and 75% of the entire imperial budget. Now here's the catch. Roman soldiers had traditionally been paid with plunder from conquests and taxes from newly acquired territories. When Rome stopped expanding, those revenue sources disappeared. But the expenses didn't. Portrait of Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Enter Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who ruled from 161 to 180 AD. History remembers him as one of the 5 good emperors, a wise Stoic who wrote beautiful meditations on virtue and duty. But Marcus Aurelius faced a crisis that philosophy couldn't solve. In 166 AD, Roman soldiers returning from campaigns in the east brought back a plague. Modern scholars think it might have been smallpox or measles. Whatever it was devastating. The Antonine Plague, as it's now called, killed between 5 and 10 million people, roughly 10% of the empire's population. Then, in 167 AD, Germanic tribes crossed the Danube and invaded Italy itself for the first time in centuries. Marcus Aurelius spent the rest of his reign fighting wars on multiple fronts: Germania, Parthia, Britain. Wars are expensive. Plagues destroy tax revenue. And Marcus Aurelius had a problem. The treasury was empty. So he made a decision. A small decision. A reasonable decision that seemed perfectly logical at the time. He debased the currency. Comparison of coins showing silver content decreasing. In 165 AD, Marcus Aurelius reduced the silver content of the denarius from 83% to 79%. Just 4%. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would cause panic. The coin still looked the same. Still weighed roughly the same. Most people probably didn't even notice. But that small decision opened a door. And once opened, it could never be fully closed again. His son, Commodus, yes, the one from Gladiator, debased it further to 74%. Still manageable. Still within reason. But here's what they didn't understand. Currency debasement is like a drug. It solves your immediate problem. It gives you a temporary high. You get more coins to pay your soldiers, fund your wars, maintain your borders. But it doesn't create real wealth. It just redistributes existing wealth through inflation. And like any drug, you build up a tolerance. Next time you need money, you need to debase it more. And more. And more. Timeline showing progressive debasement. By the year 200 AD, under Emperor Septimius Severus, the denarius was down to 50% silver. By 250 AD, it was 5%. By 270 AD, it was just a copper coin with a thin silver wash that rubbed off in your pocket. The currency that had been the bedrock of the Mediterranean economy for centuries was becoming worthless. But the emperors couldn't stop. Because they faced an impossible choice. Option A. Stop debasing the currency, let the economy stabilize, but have no money to pay the army. Result: military revolt, civil war, invasion. Option B. Keep debasing the currency, maintain the army in the short term, but destroy the economic foundation of the empire. Result: economic collapse, social disintegration, and eventually, invasion anyway. They chose option B. Every single time. Act 3, the breaking point. Chaotic montage of 3rd century crisis imager. What happened next is called the crisis of the 3rd century, and it was Rome's equivalent of the Great Depression and World War combined. Between 235 and 284 AD, just 50 years, Rome had more than 50 emperors. The average reign was less than 1 year. Most died violently. The empire fractured into 3 separate states. Plague returned. Invasions intensified. Cities were abandoned. Trade collapsed. But the economic devastation was even worse than the political chaos. Price inflation chart. Here's what hyperinflation looks like in practice. In the year 200 AD, a Roman soldier's annual salary was 300 denarii. By the year 300 AD, that same soldier was being paid nominally hundreds of thousands of denarii. But those denarii were worthless. A measure of Egyptian wheat that cost 6 drachmas in the year 200 AD cost 120,000 drachmas by 344 AD. That's a 20,000-fold increase in prices in less than 150 years. Let me put that in modern terms. Imagine if a gallon of milk that costs $4 today cost $80,000 in the year 2150. That's the scale of Roman inflation. Empty marketplace, economic stagnation. But hyperinflation doesn't just make things expensive. It destroys the entire basis of economic activity. When money becomes worthless, people stop using it. Roman citizens reverted to barter. A blacksmith would trade horseshoes directly for grain. A potter would trade vessels directly for oil. Trade became inefficient, localized, and primitive. Cities, which depend on specialized economic activity, couldn't function. Why would a farmer send grain to Rome when the payment would be worthless paper? Well, worthless bronze, by the time it arrived. Why would a craftsman create specialized goods when no one had reliable money to buy them? The Roman economy demonetized. It went backwards. Centuries of economic progress simply unwound. Wealthy Romans hoarding gold. Meanwhile, the wealthy, the senators, the landowners, the aristocrats, they understood what was happening. They saw the debasement for what it was, theft through inflation. So they did what wealthy people always do during currency crises. They hoarded real assets. Gold coins disappeared from circulation as people melted them down or buried them. Land became the only reliable store of wealth. The rich bought estates, consolidated their holdings, and created self-sufficient agricultural domains that didn't need external trade. These estates would later become the feudal manors of medieval Europe. That's not a coincidence. Feudalism was born from Rome's monetary collapse. Poor Romans suffering. But the poor? The urban workers, the small merchants, the day laborers? They were destroyed. Their savings became worthless overnight. Their wages couldn't keep pace with prices. The grain dole that had kept Rome's urban poor fed became increasingly difficult to maintain as farmers refused to sell grain for worthless money. Social mobility, one of the great achievements of the Roman Empire, disappeared. If you were born poor in the 3rd century, you died poor. There was no way out. And here's the cruelest irony. The Roman state kept trying to solve the problem with the same tools that caused it. Act 4, The Failed Fixes. Portrait of Emperor Diocletian. In 284 AD, a new emperor took power, Diocletian. He was a tough, practical military man who saw Rome's problems clearly. And he was determined to fix them. Diocletian implemented the most comprehensive reform program in Roman history. He reorganized the provinces. He expanded the army. He created a new system of government with 4 co-emperors to prevent civil wars. But his most famous reform was economic. The Edict on Maximum Prices, issued in 301 AD. Ancient inscription of the edict. This was ancient Rome's attempt at price controls. Diocletian issued a decree that listed the maximum legal price for over 1,000 goods and services. Bread, wine, meat, clothing, labor. Everything was assigned a price ceiling. Charging more than the legal maximum was punishable by death. The theory seemed sound. If inflation is making everything too expensive, just make it illegal to raise prices. The result? Economic catastrophe. Empty shops, black markets. Here's what actually happened. Merchants couldn't make a profit at the mandated prices, so they simply stopped selling. Shops closed. Goods disappeared from markets. What you can't sell legally, you sell illegally, so black markets flourished. The edict made everything worse. Within a few years, it was quietly abandoned. You can't legislate away economic reality. But Diocletian tried something else too, tax reform. He implemented a comprehensive new tax system called the indition, based on land productivity rather than monetary payments. This sounds reasonable until you realize what it meant in practice. The state was admitting its own currency was worthless. Taxes had to be paid in grain, oil, and goods because money itself had failed. Portrait of Emperor Constantine. Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337 AD, tried a different approach. He introduced a new gold coin called the solidus, and this one, he promised, would maintain its weight and purity. And to his credit, it did. The solidus was 4.5 grams of pure gold, and it stayed that way for centuries. It became the Byzantine standard and eventually influenced medieval European coinage. But here's the problem. Constantine's reform didn't restore the Roman economy. It created a two-tier system. Gold versus copper coins. The wealthy used gold solidi. The poor used the debased copper coins. Ordinary Romans still couldn't participate in the real economy. The solidus was too valuable for everyday transactions. It would be like trying to buy groceries with $1,000 bills. So Rome had stable money for the rich and worthless money for everyone else. This solved nothing except making inequality permanent. Colony working fields. By the 4th century, the Roman economy had fundamentally transformed. Free wage labor largely disappeared, replaced by the colony, tenant farmers tied to the land. These weren't quite slaves, but they weren't free either. They couldn't leave. They couldn't change professions. Their children inherited their status. Sound familiar? This was proto-serfdom. The medieval social order was emerging from Rome's economic ruins. The government, desperate for tax revenue, made professions hereditary. If your father was a baker, you had to be a baker. If your father was a merchant, you had to be a merchant. Social mobility was legally forbidden because the state needed stable, predictable tax revenue. This wasn't a medieval tyranny imposed by ignorant barbarians. This was the rational response of a sophisticated Roman bureaucracy trying to maintain a state when money no longer worked. Germanic invasions, Rome in decline. By the time the traditional fall of Rome happened in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire was already a hollow shell. The famous sack of Rome by Alaric in 410 AD, the deposition of the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 AD, these were footnotes. Symptoms, not causes. Rome had already fallen economically long before it fell militarily. The barbarians didn't destroy Rome. They inherited the ruins of a civilization that had destroyed itself. Act 5, the modern parallel. Modern dollar bills, Federal Reserve stock ticker. Now here's where this gets uncomfortable. Because everything I just described, it's not ancient history. It's a pattern, and we're watching it repeat in real time. Let me show you. Chart showing currency debasement through history. In 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the gold standard, the last link between the US dollar and any physical commodity. Before 1971, dollars were theoretically redeemable for gold. After 1971, they were backed by nothing but government promise. Sound familiar? That's exactly what happened when Rome abandoned the silver standard. Since 1971, the US dollar has lost over 85% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 in 1971 costs over $7 today. The Federal Reserve has increased the money supply from about $600 billion in 1971 to over $20 trillion today. That's the same trajectory as the Roman denarius, just in decades instead of centuries because everything moves faster now. Government debt clock. The United States national debt is currently over $35 trillion. That's larger than the entire U.S. economy. The annual budget deficit, just the yearly increase in debt, is approaching $2 trillion. How do we pay for this? The same way Rome did. We debase the currency. We print money. We inflate our way out of debt. The Federal Reserve has created trillions of dollars through quantitative easing, which is just a sophisticated term for what Marcus Aurelius did. Make more coins when you run out of money. Military spending chart. And just like Rome, we face the same impossible choice. We have a massive military spread across the world. Over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries. The U.S. defense budget is over $800 billion annually, more than the next 10 countries combined. We're trying to maintain an empire while running trillion-dollar deficits. We're debasing our currency to pay for it. We're hoping that because the dollar is the global reserve currency, we can get away with it indefinitely. Rome thought the same thing about the denarius. Wealth inequality statistics. Here's another parallel that should terrify you. Wealth inequality. In Rome's final centuries, wealth became concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite while the middle class disappeared. Today, the top 1% of Americans control more wealth than the entire middle class. The top 10% own 67% of all wealth. This isn't a moral judgment. It's an observation about economic stability. Highly unequal societies with worthless currency and a disappearing middle class don't end well. Rome is proof. Price inflation, housing, education, healthcare. And just like in Rome, the effects hit different people differently. If you own assets, stocks, real estate, gold, you're protected. These assets inflate along with the currency. The wealthy get wealthier during inflation. But if you rely on wages, if you save in dollars, if you don't own property, you're a 3rd century Roman peasant watching your savings become worthless. College tuition has increased 180% since 2000. Housing prices have increased over 200% in many major cities since 2000. Healthcare costs have exploded. But wages? Adjusted for real inflation, median wages have barely moved in 40 years. Your money is worth less, but your paycheck isn't growing to match. That's inflation in action. Retirement crisis statistics. 45% of Americans have zero retirement savings. The median retirement account for Americans approaching retirement age is under $100,000, enough to generate maybe $4,000 per year in income. Why? Because decades of currency debasement have destroyed the ability to save. When money loses value, saving becomes pointless. You need assets. But if you don't have wealth to begin with, how do you acquire assets? This is exactly what happened in Rome. The middle class couldn't save their way to security because the currency was worthless. So they fell into permanent poverty. Gig economy, modern workers. Here's another parallel: the collapse of stable employment. In late Rome, free wage labor disappeared, replaced by tide labor and subsistence farming. Today, we're seeing the rise of the gig economy. Uber drivers, DoorDash delivery, freelance everything. No benefits. No stability. No guaranteed hours. We're not creating modern colony yet, but we're moving in that direction. When currency is unstable, long-term employment contracts become impossible. Everything becomes short-term, precarious, contingent. Political instability montage. And politically? Rome's final centuries were marked by constant instability, short-lived leaders, military strongmen, and the breakdown of institutional norms. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about modern parallels there. Timeline comparison, Rome versus modern. Here's the timeline comparison that should keep you up at night. Rome's monetary crisis took about 200 years from the first debasement under Marcus Aurelius in 165 AD to the collapse of the Western Empire. The US has been off the gold standard for 54 years. We're about a quarter of the way through Rome's timeline, and we're already seeing similar symptoms. Currency debasement, wealth inequality, political instability, imperial overreach, and the slow erosion of the middle class. If we follow Rome's trajectory at the current pace, we have maybe another 150 years. But remember, everything moves faster now. Economics, politics, technology, all of it operates at an accelerated pace compared to the ancient world. What took Rome 2 centuries might take us 50 years. Maybe less. Act 6, conclusion. Fading Roman ruins. So what do we learn from Rome's collapse? Here are 3 takeaways you need to understand. Takeaway 1. Currency debasement is always a trap. It seems like a solution in the short term. It lets you pay your bills, fund your wars, maintain your empire. But it doesn't create real wealth. It just steals purchasing power from everyone who holds the currency. And once you start, you can't stop without facing the pain you've been avoiding. Rome knew this. The emperors weren't stupid. They understood what debasement meant. But they did it anyway because the alternative, military collapse, civil war, invasion, seemed worse. We face the same choice today. We can either accept painful economic reforms now, or continue inflating until the currency fails completely. We're choosing the latter, just like Rome did. Takeaway 2. Empires are expensive, and someone has to pay for them. Rome's empire was built on conquest and plunder. When conquest stopped, the economic model broke. But they couldn't shrink the military without losing territory. They couldn't lose territory without losing tax revenue. They couldn't lose tax revenue without shrinking the military. It was a death spiral with no exit. The United States faces a similar trap. We maintain global military dominance at enormous cost. We run massive deficits to pay for it. We inflate our currency to cover the deficits. Eventually, the currency fails, and the empire becomes unsustainable. There's no escaping this logic. Empires collapse when their costs exceed their revenues, and inflating the currency just delays the reckoning. Takeaway 3. The middle class is the foundation of stability. Rome's strength wasn't its legions or its emperors. It was the millions of small farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and traders who created value and paid taxes. When inflation destroyed the middle class, Rome lost its foundation. Today, we're watching the same erosion. The middle class is shrinking. Wealth is concentrating. Saving is becoming impossible. And with every year of inflation, it gets worse. History is clear. Societies with a strong middle class are stable and prosperous. Societies where wealth is concentrated in a tiny elite are fragile and short-lived. Modern cityscape. Here's the warning. Rome didn't end with a bang. There was no apocalyptic final battle. No dramatic moment when everything collapsed at once. Instead, it was a slow fade. A gradual decline. Each generation slightly worse off than the last. Each decade a little more chaotic than the previous one. Until one day, people woke up and realized the empire was just gone. That's what currency collapse looks like in real life. Not a sudden crash, but a generational erosion of prosperity and stability. And if we follow Rome's playbook, if we keep debasing our currency, running unsustainable deficits, and ignoring the warnings, we'll get the same ending Rome got. Split screen, Roman ruins / modern skyline. The question is, are we smart enough to change course? Rome wasn't. Every attempt at reform was too little, too late. By the time they understood the problem, the damage was irreversible. We still have time, but not much. The economic forces Rome unleashed took centuries to fully play out. We've compressed that timeline to decades. The clock is ticking.